I have buried 3 men, one horse I loved better than most of them, and one lie so big it took a whole winter to dig the grave. The lie belonged to Silas Vance, and the strange thing, the thing I still turn over at night the way I turn the stem of this dead watch of mine, round and round, waiting for a tick that never comes, is that he didn't tell it to cheat anybody. He told it to a woman who crossed an ocean to marry him. He told it to a woman who then sold the last piece of her dead mother to keep his roof over both their heads. He was rich, richer than the banker in town, richer than the men who tipped their hats to him out of pity. And he let her believe they were dirt poor. He let her go hungry. He let her freeze. He let her cut away the only thing she had left of home. And he sat there on top of a fortune and said nothing. Now before you decide you hate him, and you will for a while, I did too, you ought to know why a man does a thing like that. Because the answer isn't greed. I wish to God it had been greed. Greed I understand. Greed you can hang. This is harder than greed. My name is Ezra Coombs, and I worked the Vance spread for 11 years, and I'm going to tell you exactly what I saw from the night she came half froze off the freight wagon to the morning the truth came out of the ground. Stay with me. It gets worse before it gets better, and I'm not entirely sure it ever finished getting better at all. The wind that January came down off the ridge like it had a personal grudge, and I remember thinking, standing in the barn door with a lantern that kept guttering, that no woman in her right mind would step off a wagon into it. She stepped off anyway. I saw the freighter's rig come up the trace an hour after dark, later than it had any business being, the mules blowing steam and the wheels crusted white. Old Hobbs was driving, and Hobbs never came this far up unless the money was good, so I already knew something was different before I knew what. Silas came out onto the porch in his shirt sleeves, no coat, the fool, in that cold, and he stood very still. I'd known the man 4 years by then, and I had never once seen him stand that still. Hobbs climbed down, said something I couldn't hear, and then he reached up and helped a bundle of shawls down off the seat, and the bundle had a face. She was small. That's the first thing that struck me, small the way a bird is small, all the more so because everything around her was big and hard, the mules, the wagon, the wind, Silas. She had a wool shawl over her head and another over her shoulders, and her hands were pressed together inside the sleeves, and her lips had gone the gray-blue of a body pulled from a creek. She'd come from San Francisco. She'd come from further than that, but San Francisco was the last leg, and the last leg had been open wagon through 2 days of this. Evening, Silas said. She looked up at him. Whatever she'd expected, and I have wondered since what a woman expects when she's been shipped across the whole width of the world to a man she's never met. Whatever it was, she took him in without a flinch. Big shoulders, face like a cliff somebody had quit carving halfway, a patched coat hanging on a peg behind him that was worth about 40 cents. She looked at all of it, and she gave a small bow, quick and neat, and she said a word I didn't understand. Silas didn't understand it either, but he nodded like he did, and that was the first kindness I ever saw pass between them. 2 people, neither one speaking the other's tongue, both pretending they'd caught the meaning so as not to shame the other. Ezra, he didn't look at me. Get her inside. Get the fire up. I got her inside, and here is where I have to tell you about the house, because the house is the whole beginning of the lie. The Vance house was mean. I don't mean small, small would have been honest. I mean deliberately in a way I didn't have words for at the time. Sod backed against the hill, a timber front gone silver with weather, 1 room and a loft, a hearth that smoked. The furniture was what a man makes himself with a bad saw. There was a rope bed and a table and 2 stools and a shelf of tin. A stranger walking in would have counted the whole worth of the place at maybe $11 and been generous by 2. I got the fire up. She stood by it and did not go closer than she had to, and she did not sit, though I set a stool for her. She kept her back straight and her hands folded and her eyes moving over the tin, over the smoke-black beams, over the single sad window with its oiled paper instead of glass, and I watched her do the arithmetic. I watched her understand what she'd married into. Poverty. Bone poverty. The kind you don't climb out of, you only get buried under. And she did not cry. I want that on the record right at the start, because so much of what came later people have gotten wrong. She did not cry, and she did not turn to go back out to Hobbs's wagon, and she did not look at Silas with anything you could rightly call reproach. She just set her jaw, squared it, like a soldier who's counted the enemy and found the number bad but has decided to hold the line regardless. Her name, we learned across the next several days of pointing and drawing in the ash, was May. Lynn May Hua, the whole of it, though Silas only ever managed May, said soft like it might break. She'd come through a marriage broker in San Francisco, one of those men who trade in loneliness, women on one side and grass widowers and homesteaders on the other, and takes his cut off the top of both. What the broker had told Silas about her, I don't know. What the broker had told her about Silas, I found out much later, and it made me want to ride to San Francisco and break the man's hands. He'd told her Silas Vance was a landowner. Which was true, it just wasn't the truth. They were married 3 days after she came, by a circuit preacher who happened through and who married them in the yard because May would not, this we understood by her firm's small headshakes, be married inside that dark house. She wanted sky over it. She wore the good dress she'd carried in her one trunk, blue silk gone soft with age, and it did not belong to that yard, to the mud and the frost-killed weeds and the leaning fence, any more than a hummingbird belongs to a coal pit. She stood in the wind in her mother's country's colors and married a man she couldn't speak to, and I stood witness with my hat in my hands, and I remember winding my watch 4 times through the ceremony because I didn't know what else to do with my hands, and the watch has never once told the time, not since Sarah, but the winding calms me. Silas noticed. He always noticed. He gave me a look that said, "Quit it," and I quit it, and I was glad of the look because it was ordinary and everything else about the day was not. That night I bunked in the barn, same as always, and I slept badly the way you do when the wind won't quit, and somewhere in the black middle of it I got up to check on the mare who was near her time. That's when I saw the light. Not from the house was dark, both of them long abed, or as abed as strangers are on a first married night, which is to say probably lying stiff and staring on opposite edges of the same rope bed. The light came from behind the house. From the old root cellar dug into the hill, the one with the plank door I'd never once seen open in 4 years, the one Silas kept a lock on that I'd assumed guarded potatoes and pickled truck and nothing worth locking. He was down there. I could see the yellow seam of a lantern around the door's edges, and I could hear faint, muffled by earth, a sound I knew and couldn't place, a small, hard chiming, metal on metal, the way coins talk when a man runs his hand through them. I stood in the cold in my union suit, and I listened to my rich, poor, married, secret employer count his money in a hole in the ground on his wedding night, while his frozen new wife slept above him believing she'd been sold into want. I did not understand it. I want to be honest about that, too. I stood there and I felt the first cold finger of something that wasn't the weather, and I told myself, Ezra, that's his business and none of yours, and I went back to the barn and I did not sleep at all. But I started watching after that. A man can't help it. Once you've heard the coins, you hear them everywhere. What I want you to understand about that first month is how hard she worked, and how little she was given to work with, and how she never once let on that she knew she'd been cheated. Because she had to have known. A woman that sharp, and May was sharp, sharp as the little folding knife she kept in her sleeve, and used for everything from mending to skinning to, once, warning off a drifter who came sniffing while Silas was at the far pasture. A woman that sharp knows the difference between a man who has nothing and a man who is keeping it from her. She just didn't have the words yet to say so, and maybe by the time she had the words she'd decided the saying wasn't worth it, or she'd decided something else. I've turned that over a lot. I'll get to it. She scrubbed that mean house until the tin shelf shone. She patched Silas's 40-cent coat with tiny stitches you'd have needed a glass to count, and she patched mine too, unasked. The week she caught me sewing a torn cuff with the clumsiness of a man who's been a widower long enough to forget his wife ever did such things for him. And when she handed it back, her eyes went to the little photograph I keep in my breast pocket, Sarah's, gone brown, and she didn't ask and I didn't say, but she gave me a nod. One nod, woman to widower. And I'll tell you, that nod undid me more than a whole speech of sympathy in plain English would have. She learned the garden that a woman before her, there'd been talk of a first Mrs. Vance, years gone, that Silas never spoke of and I never asked, had let go to weed. She learned the chickens. She learned, from me, with much pointing and both of us laughing at the wall of language between us, how to gentle the mare, and that mare who'd throw a Christian through nobody once May had her hands in her mane, and was murmuring the low water-over-stone sounds of her own language into the horse's ear. She ate less than a bird. I noticed that, too. When the beans ran thin toward the end of a month, and they ran thin because Silas kept us on the ragged edge of nothing, bought the cheapest cuts, mended rather than replaced, would sooner cut off his own hand than spend a coin where a splinter would do. When the beans ran thin, May served Silas full and me near full, and took for herself a bowl a child would have called stingy. And she did it in a way that looked like custom, like it was simply how her people did, so that neither of us could argue. But I watched. I'd hear the coins in the hill at night, and then I'd watch her scrape the pot for her own supper in the morning, and something in me started to go from confused to angry, slow, the way a green log finally catches. Because Silas saw it too. That was the part I couldn't stomach. He wasn't a stupid man, and he wasn't a blind one. He watched his wife go thin and quiet and uncomplaining through a hard winter, watched her sell, I'll get to what she sold, watched her give and give out of an empty purse, and he had a hole in the hill full of gold, and he said nothing. He got quieter. He got, if you can credit it, kinder in the small ways, chopping more wood than we needed so the fire could run hot for her, walking 2 miles in the cold to bring back a paper of the tea she liked from the one Chinese grocer 40 miles off, which cost him a whole day and which he never explained, just set the little packet by her hand and turned away before she could thank him. But he did not fill her plate from the hill. He would not. I hated him a little that first winter. I'll admit it plainly. I'd known Silas Vance as a hard, fair, close-mouthed man, a good man to work for if you didn't need him to talk, and I'd have said before May came that there wasn't a cruel bone in him. And here was cruelty, wasn't it? A man watching his wife starve on principle while he sat on a fortune. What else do you call that? I called it that for a long time. I was wrong, but I was wrong for reasons that took me a whole story to learn. So you'll have to be patient with me the way I had to be patient with him. The first crack in May, the first time I saw the straight back bend, came in February over a jade. She wore it always. A small carving on a red cord around her neck, tucked under her collar so you mostly didn't see it. A green stone gone to that deep water color the best jade goes, carved into some creature, a fish, I thought at first, then a dragon small enough to curl in a thimble. When she thought no one watched, she'd take it out and hold it in her fist and press her fist to her breastbone and close her eyes and her lips would move. Not praying exactly, more like reporting, telling somebody far off how the day had gone. I asked her about it once, the only time, by pointing and raising my brows the way we'd learned to talk. She held it out on her palm for me to see but not to touch. And she said, in the handful of English she'd gathered by then, careful, each word set down like a cup that might spill. My mother, give me last thing. Last thing, her mother was dead then. And this green fish dragon was the last of her. The last of a whole country, a whole life, a whole language of people who'd have understood her without pointing, that May had carried across the ocean into a smoking sod house on a frozen hill at the end of the world. I nodded and I looked away because my own hand had gone to my breast pocket, to Sarah's photograph, without my telling it to, and May saw, and we stood there a moment, 2 people at the far edge of the earth, each holding the last thing. I tell you all this so that you'll feel it, really feel it in the gut, not just the head, when I tell you what she did with it. Because at the tail of February, the fever came through the valley. It took the Halloran children first, down the trace, and then it took old Hobbs the freighter, and then it came up our hill and it took Silas. Took him fast and hard, the way it does the big strong ones sometimes, as if it resents them. One evening he was splitting wood too long in the cold, stubborn, sweating, and then chilling. By the next night he was on the rope bed talking to people who weren't in the room. Talking to a brother, I remember, a name, Amos, Amos, put it back, Amos, over and over, pleading. A big man reduced to pleading with the ceiling, and May kneeling by him wiping his face, and not understanding the words but understanding the fear in them, which is the one thing that needs no translation. He needed the doctor. The doctor was in town, 30 miles, and the doctor did not ride out to sod house folk on charity, not in a fever winter with paying patients in town dying by the dozen. The doctor needed to be paid, and paid up front, and paid well, because the roads were bad and the risk was real. And there was, so far as May knew, no money. There was money. It was 60 yards from where Silas lay dying under a plank door with a lock in a hole in the hill, more money than the doctor would earn in 10 years. I knew it was there. I'd heard it chime. And I stood in that doorway with my useless dead watch in my hand, and I faced the worst choice of my life to that point, which was whether to tell her. Because it wasn't mine to tell. And because I didn't know it, I'd heard coins, was all. I'd never seen the inside of that cellar. For all I truly knew, it was some poor hoard of pennies a miser'd frightened himself over. And because, God forgive me, this is the true reason, the ugly one, because I was afraid of Silas. Afraid of what a man that secret would do to a man who'd cracked his secret open. I had 11 years of nothing behind me and no place else to go, and I was 51 and my back was going, and I kept my mouth shut to keep my place. So I said nothing, and May, who had no money and no cellar to raid and no language even to beg the doctor proper, May did the arithmetic one more time, the same cold, clear arithmetic she'd done her first night in that house. This is the number is bad. Hold the line anyway, and she reached up and lifted the red cord over her head. I knew what she meant to do before she did. I said, May, no, May, there's got to be. And I ran out of the sentence because there was no other way to finish it that I was brave enough to say. She looked at me, her face was very calm. That was the terrible part, how calm. She held the jade in her fist and pressed it once to her breastbone, one last report to her mother. I'm sorry, I have to, he'll die. And then she wrapped it in a scrap of the blue silk from her wedding dress, and she saddled the mare herself in the black cold, and she rode 30 miles through a fever winter to a town that hated the sight of her, to sell the last of her mother to a pawnbroker for the price of a doctor's ride, to save the life of the man who was letting her do it. She did not know he was rich. He knew she was going. He was fevered, half out of his head, but there was a moment as she was pulling on her boots by the door when his eyes came clear. I saw it. I was standing right there. His eyes came clear, and they went to her hands, to the empty place at her throat where the cord had been, to the little silk-wrapped bundle in her fist, and he understood. For 1 second, Vance understood exactly what his wife was about to sell, and exactly what he had lying in the hill that would have made it needless, and I watched the knowledge cross his face like a shadow crossing a field. And then he shut his eyes. He shut his eyes, and he let her go. I have hated a lot of things in my life. I have never hated anything the way I hated Silas Vance for the exact length of time it took that mare to carry his wife out of the yard and into the dark. She'd be back in 2 days if the fever winter didn't take her too. 2 days. And in those 2 days I found out why he'd shut his eyes. I found out what was in the hill, and I found out what Amos, put it back, meant. And I found out that the meanest, cruelest thing I thought I'd ever witnessed was neither of those things at all. But that's the next part, and I'll need to wind this watch a while before I can tell it. She was gone 2 nights and part of a 3rd day, and in the between time, with Silas raving on the rope bed, I did the thing I'd sworn to myself I'd never do. I opened the cellar. I want to say I did it for a clean reason. I want to say I thought, if there's money in there, I'll pay the doctor myself and spare her the jade, and that was in it, some of it, honestly. But by the time I did it, she was already a full day gone, already 30 miles down the road with the green stone in her fist, and it was too late to spare her anything. So I won't pretend. I did it because Silas was too fevered to stop me, and because I'd heard those coins chime for 4 years and I'd reached the far end of what a man can stand not knowing. I did it out of anger and grief and low common curiosity, and I've made my peace with that, more or less. The lock was better than the door deserved, a real lock, a town lock, not the kind a sodbuster owns. I found the key where I'd have found it if I'd ever let myself look, on a nail behind the smoke-black beam under under a photograph. I'll come to the photograph. I went down the earth steps with a lantern, and I'll tell you what I expected. A strongbox, some coin, a miser's poor pile. What I found sat me down on the bottom step with the lantern shaking in my hand. It wasn't a pile, it was an accounting. Gold, yes, canvas sacks of it, double eagles, more coin than I'd seen in one place in my life, enough to buy the whole valley and the town at the end of it. But that wasn't what stopped my breath. What stopped my breath were the papers, deeds, bank drafts on a San Francisco house drawn in a name that wasn't Vance, certificates of stock in a railroad and a shipping line. A ledger, a real ledger, leather, filled front to back in a small, hard, careful hand. And I opened it, and I read by lantern light the whole shape of a life I'd worked beside for 4 years and never once seen. Silas Vance was worth, near as that ledger let me reckon, upward of $90,000. And every line of that ledger, every deposit and deed and draft, was dated and set down and hidden. And in the front of the ledger, on the first page in that same hard hand, was written a single line that I read maybe 40 times sitting on that cold step, and that I have never once forgotten. What we took from Amos, held in trust, spent on nothing, kept against the day. I didn't understand it, not yet. But I understood the word trust, and I understood that this was not a miser's hoard. A miser spends on himself in secret small pleasures. This man spent on nothing. He'd sat on $90,000 and worn a 40-cent coat and eaten thin beans and let 2 wives. I was near sure now there'd been a first, live and maybe die in a smoking hole. And it wasn't greed. Greed at least gets used. Greed buys something. This was a man punishing himself. This was a man doing penance so hard, and so long he'd forgotten it was penance and just called it his life. And I remembered Amos, put it back, pleated to the ceiling, and I began to be afraid I understood after all. I went back up, I locked the door, I put the key on its nail. And I looked this time at the photograph that hung behind the beam that the key hung under, that I'd never had cause to look at close. 2 young men, miners by their gear, arms across each other's shoulders, grinning the grin of men who have just struck it. One was Silas, 20 years younger before the cliff of his face got carved. The other had the same jaw and the same brow and was laughing wider, the way the younger brother always laughs wider. On the back in a woman's hand, their mother's, I'd guess it said, Silas and Amos, the Blue Rock Claim, 1861. I put it back exactly as I found it. And I went and sat by Silas, who was sleeping now. The fever broke a little, and I watched the man breathe, and I did the hardest turning over of my whole life, trying to fit the cruelty I'd seen, the shut eyes, the thin plate, the let her go, against a ledger that said held in trust, and a picture of a laughing brother nobody ever mentioned, and a bad dream that begged a dead man to put it back. May came home on the 3rd day. The mare came up the trace at a walk, near foundered, and May sat her like a woman made of wood, so cold and so tired she'd gone past shivering into a stillness that scared me worse than shaking would have. But she'd done it. The doctor's rig came up the hill an hour behind her. She'd paid him from the little silk-wrapped nothing that used to be her mother. And he'd come, grumbling, and he saw Silas, and he did his doctoring, and he took his fee, and he went. And by the doctor's own gruff words, Silas would likely live, having a constitution like a barn. He'd have lived off the money in the hill just as well, but it wasn't the money in the hill that saved him. It was a green stone shaped like a fish that was a dragon that had crossed an ocean. That was the last of a dead woman in a country May would never see again. That evening, with Silas breathing easy and the doctor gone, May sat by the fire and did not eat and did not speak. Her hand kept going up to her throat, to the empty place where the cord had been for, I didn't know how long. Her whole life, maybe. And finding it empty each time, her hand came down again, slow and folded in her lap. And her face didn't change. And that was the worst of it, that her face didn't change, that she'd learned so well how to hold the line that even losing the last of her mother, she sat straight-backed by a stranger's fire and did not let one thing show. I couldn't stand it. God help me, I nearly told her that night. I got as far as her name. May, and she looked up, and I looked at her tired, brave, empty-throated face, and I looked at Silas asleep, and I lost my nerve, because it wasn't mine to tell, because it would break something I couldn't see the shape of, because I was a coward and a hired man and 51 years old with a bad back and no place else to go. You did right, I said instead, which was true and useless. Writing for the doctor, you saved him. She looked at me a while. Then she said, and it was the longest string of English I'd yet heard her put together, slow, each cup set down careful and not spilled, in my country. A wife saves the husband. It is not a gift, she searched. It is a debt already there before I come. A debt already there before she came. She'd married a stranger sight unseen and crossed the world to a hole in a hill, and she counted saving his life not as love and not as sacrifice, but as a debt she'd owed him from the moment the broker sold her name, a debt she paid with her mother's bones and expected no thanks for. I thought about the ledger, held in trust, 2 people in that house keeping accounts nobody could see, and I thought, sitting there, I remember thinking it clear as a bell, these 2 are the same. God Almighty. He hid a fortune out of a debt he couldn't pay, and she paid a debt she didn't owe, and neither one of them will say a word about the price, and they are exactly the same, and they don't know it, and it's going to break them both. Silas mended slow across March. And here is where the story turns, because as he mended, he changed. Or rather, something in him that had been locked as tight as that cellar door started, just barely to give. He knew what she'd sold. He'd seen her hands empty at her throat when the fever cleared, and he'd asked me low when she was out at the chickens, "The jade, where's the jade?" Not a question, hardly, he knew. And I told him I was done sparing him. I told him plain. She sold it, in town, for the doctor to come save your life. Sold the last of her dead mother, because far as she knew there wasn't $2 in this house, Silas, far as she knew. And I let that far as she knew sit there between us like a loaded gun on the table. He didn't say anything. He got up too soon, still weak, and he went and stood in the cellar-side window a long time looking at the hill. Then he did something he'd never done in 4 years. He came and sat by me at the barn that night, and he talked. He told me about Amos. They'd struck it together, the two of them, the Blue Rock Claim, 1861, two brothers from a Missouri nothing farm who'd gone west with a mule and a grudge against being poor and had, against every odd, hit a real strike, a fortune in the ground. And they'd been happy, drunk happy, the way you see in the photograph. And then men had come. Men always come when there's a strike. Claim jumpers, a rough crew, and there'd been a night. And Silas had been down the gulch, and Amos had been at the claim. And Amos was the younger and the wider grinning, and the one who'd never once in his life backed down from anything. Amos had told them to put it back. The gold, put it back, it's ours. And they'd shot him for it and taken what they could carry, and Silas had come up the gulch at the sound and found his brother dying in the dirt over a hole in the ground, and Amos's last living act had been to grip Silas's wrist and say, Silas told me this looking at the barn wall, not at me, in a voice I'd never heard out of him. Amos had said, "Don't let them have it. Don't you dare let them have it, see, keep it. Keep it against the day. Against the day." What day, Amos never said. Amos died before he said. And Silas, 23 years old, his brother's blood on his hands, a fortune half stolen and half still in the ground and men riding off with the rest, Silas got it back. Got all of it back over the next black year in ways he wouldn't tell me and I didn't ask. Got it back and more. And then he sat down on it, and he never spent a dime because every dime was Amos's, held in trust, kept against the day, and to spend it, to buy comfort, to buy a decent coat, to fill a plate, was to say Amos had died over nothing but money. And Silas would sooner have died himself than say that. So he punished the money by never using it. He punished himself by living poor as penance for having lived when Amos didn't. He'd married the first time, I had it right, there'd been a first Mrs. Vance, and he'd kept the secret from her too, and she'd left him, worn out and bitter, believing herself the wife of a failure, never knowing she'd been the wife of the richest man in the county. She'd left, and Silas had taken that too as a thing he deserved. And then older, lonelier than a man can rightly bear, he'd let a broker sell him a wife from across the world. And he'd meant, he told me this last, quiet, ashamed, he'd meant to do right by May. He'd meant this time someday to tell her to open the hill to let her have the comfort. He'd just needed to know first. Needed to be sure she'd married him, Silas Vance, the man, and not what he had. Because his first wife at the end had thrown it at him, that she'd have stayed for money, that a decent house would have held her, and it had gone into him like a splinter and festered there for years. Did anyone ever want me, or only what I might turn out to have? So he'd tested her, not on purpose, not cruel, or not meaning to be cruel. He just let the poverty stand a while and watched, and told himself, once I'm sure, I'll tell her. And while he was making sure, she rode 30 miles through a fever winter and sold her dead mother to save his life. You were sure, I said. It came out harder than I meant. Silas, you were sure the second she took that jade off her neck. You told me you shut your eyes, you knew. I knew, he said. Then why in God's name didn't you stop her? You could have told her right there. There's gold in the hill, girl, don't sell your mother. 3 seconds. Why'd you shut your eyes? And Silas Vance, $90,000, a face like a half-carved cliff, a brother in the ground. Silas put his face in his 2 big hands, and he said the truest and most terrible thing I ever heard a man say about himself. Because I'd got so used to keeping it, he said, I didn't know how to open my mouth. Ezra, I've kept it shut so long I forgot there was a way to open it. I sat there and I watched her take it off and I reached for the words and there weren't any. 23 years I built that wall and it don't have a door in it. It don't have a door. I didn't have anything to say to that. I still don't altogether. I've known men ruined by drink and by grief and by meanness, but I never before nor since knew a man ruined by keeping. He'd kept faith with a dead brother so hard and so long that he couldn't keep faith with a living wife. He'd built a wall to honor Amos and walled himself away from every soul who might have loved him. And the awful arithmetic of it, the same cold arithmetic May did every night over the bean pot, was that he knew. He knew what it was costing. He just couldn't find the door. You've got to tell her, I said. I know it. You've got to get that jade back, whatever it costs. That pawnbroker's got it 30 miles off, and you've got $90,000 in a hole, and you're going to sit here. I know it, he said. Ezra. I know it. And there was something in how he said it, some plan already turning behind the cliff of his face, that I couldn't read, and that I should have asked about, and that I didn't. That was the last week of March. He didn't tell her that week, nor the next, and I started to despair of him, started to think the wall really had no door, that he'd carry it to his grave and hers. But he was doing something. He'd saddle up and be gone a full day, twice, 3 times, and come back saying nothing, and I put it down to cattle business. It wasn't cattle business. And May all this while was getting quietly, deeply sicker, not the fever that had passed her by, but something slower, a thinness that wasn't only the bean pot. A stillness that had stopped looking like strength and started looking like a light going down. She'd lost the jade, and she'd lost the last thread to her mother and her country and herself, and she'd given it for a man who, she believed, had nothing to give back and never had, a man she was bound to for life in a hole in a hill at the end of the world. She held the line. She always held the line, but I could see that April that she'd started to wonder what the line was even for. She found the cellar open on a Thursday. Silas had left it unlocked. I have wondered every day since whether he did it on purpose, whether that was his door at last, the only kind of door a man like that could make, a lock left open and a truth left lying where she'd have to find it because he still couldn't push the words past the wall, or whether he was just careless, mending, tired, and forgot. I never asked. Some things you don't ask even at the end because either answer is more than the man can carry. But she found it open, and she went down. And I was in the yard when she came back up. And I have never before or since seen a human face hold so much at one time. And I'll have to tell that in the last part, because my hand's gone unsteady, and this dead watch won't wind itself, and some things you have to come at slow or not at all. She came up out of the hill into the flat white April light with the leather ledger held against her chest in both arms, the way you'd carry a child or a wound. I was mending fence in the yard. Silas was gone, one of his day-long rides, the ones I still thought were cattle. So it was just me to see her, and I set down the hammer and I stood, because there wasn't anything else a man could do in front of a face like that. She'd read enough, that was plain. She had the words by April, most of them, and the ledger was in a plain enough hand, and she'd stood in that cellar with the sacks of double eagles and the deeds and the drafts, $90,000 of them, and she'd understood, the way I'd understood on the cold step, the exact shape of the thing. That she had married a rich man, that she had lived poor in his house by his choosing, that she had gone thin and cold through a winter while he sat on a fortune, and that she had ridden 30 miles and sold the last living piece of her mother to pay a doctor's fee that this man could have paid 1,000 times over out of a hole 60 yards from where he lay letting her go. She had understood all that, and her face, I keep trying to find the word and there isn't one in my language, maybe there's one in hers, her face wasn't rage. I'd have welcomed rage. Rage I could have stood beside her in. It was past rage. It was the face of someone who has just learned that the ground she's been standing on her whole married life was never there, that every step she took in faith was over a drop, that the man she'd bound her one life to had watched her sell her mother and chosen to let it happen. She looked at me, and she said, very quiet in the careful English she'd built cup by cup across a winter, "You knew." I couldn't lie to her, not to that face. "I heard the coins," I said. "For years I heard them at night. I never saw inside till the fever. I never had the right to tell you it was his to." "You knew," not louder, just laid down again, flat, final, a stone set on my chest. "When I take off the jade, you knew, and you let me ride." "I did," I said. "God forgive me." "I did." And do you know what she did then? She nodded. One nod. The same nod she'd given me the day she patched my cuff and saw Sarah's photograph. Woman to widower, one soul to another. I see you, I see what you carry. Except now it meant the opposite, and it was worse than any curse she could have laid, because it said, I understand. You were afraid. You were a small, frightened man with no place else to go. I don't even blame you. And that is how alone I have been in this house. That the one person who might have warned me was too afraid, and I don't even get to blame him. Then she turned and walked to the house with the ledger and shut the door, and I stood in the yard with a hammer at my feet, and I have never in my life felt smaller. Silas came home at dusk. He came up the trace tired and dust-gray, and I saw it even from the fence, there was something in his coat, held careful against his side, and something in his face that I'd have called on any other man hope. He saw my face first. He always noticed. He stopped the horse and he looked at me, and he looked at the house with its shut door and its one dark oiled paper window, and the hope went out of him like a lamp in wind. She found it, he said. She found it. He sat the horse a moment. Then he got down, slow, and he took whatever it was out of his coat and held it in his two hands and looked at it. and I saw that it was small and wrapped in a scrap of blue silk, and my heart turned right over in my chest. He'd got it back, all those day-long rides. He tracked that jade from the pawnbroker in town to a trader to God knows where, a green fish that was a dragon, small enough to curl in a thimble, one stone among 1,000 in the wide, indifferent world. And he'd spent, I found out later, near $400 and 3 weeks of hard riding to run it to ground and buy it back. $400 out of the hole he could never spend for himself, out of Amos's trust, the first dime I'd wager that Silas Vance had spent on a living soul's comfort in 23 years. He'd found the door after all. The door was her mother wrapped in blue silk, carried home against his ribs. But he'd found it a day too late. She'd already gone down into the hill. She'd already learned the whole of it, not gently, not from his own mouth with the jade in his hand and the words "I'm sorry, I did wrong here," but alone, in the dark, off a ledger, in the cold accounting of that hard, careful hand. "Silas," I said, go in and give it to her, tell her all of it. Amos, the wall, the not having a door, all of it, right now, tonight, before it sets." He looked at the shut door a long time. "Ezra," he said, "what if I open my mouth and there's still no words?" "Then hand her the jade," I said, "and let the jade do the talking. Go." He went. I wasn't in the room. I want to be honest at the end about the edges of what I know. I was in the barn with the mare, and I couldn't hear words through sod and timber, only the low of two voices, his and hers, going a long time into the night, longer than I'd have thought two people with a wall between them could find to say. Once I heard the register of hers go up sharp, the only time I ever heard May raise her voice, and I flinched for him and thought, good, let her, he's earned it. And a long silence after. And then the two voices low again, low and slow, down toward the small hours until they stopped, and I couldn't tell you whether they stopped in peace or in the particular silence of two people who have said everything and settled nothing. In the morning, she was still there. I'll tell you that much because I know it's the thing you want to know, the way I wanted to know it, standing in the barn all that long night. In the morning, she was at the fire, and the jade was back at her throat on a new red cord, and her hand didn't go up to check for it anymore, which told me she'd relearned it was there. But I won't tell you they were mended, because that would be the neat lie, and I've had my fill of those, and so, God knows, have they. Here's what I can tell you true, from what I saw across the years that followed, and you can make of it what your own heart makes of it. They stayed married. The wall, his wall, the one with no door, never fully came down. A man doesn't rebuild in a night what took him 23 years to wall up, and May knew that, and stopped expecting the whole wall, and started, I think, learning to live in the yard beside it, the way she'd wanted to be married in the yard under sky that first cold day. He spent the money after that, some of it. Not lavish. Silas couldn't do lavish. Amos was still in the ground and always would be. But a real house went up that summer, timber and glass windows, a house with light in it, and he built it in the yard where the sky was, and I understood that too. He bought her passage once back across the ocean to lay a stone for her mother, offered it, rather. She went, and she came back, and I never knew what passed at that grave and never asked. He kept a lamp lit in the window every night she was gone. But something was gone that didn't come back, and they both knew it, and they were both too honest to pretend otherwise. She had loved him, I'm near sure of it now, near sure she'd started to, that hard winter, the way you love a person you're bound to and choose quietly to keep choosing. And he had broken the one thing love runs on, which is not money and is not even faithfulness. It's the belief that when you are falling, the other one will reach out a hand and not shut his eyes. He'd shut his eyes. She'd felt herself fall 30 miles through a fever winter with her mother in her fist, and she'd learned in the cellar that he'd watched her fall and chosen the wall over her hand. You can go on from a thing like that. People do. But you go on knowing it, the both of you, forever, a stone set in the middle of the table between you that no amount of years quite lets you carry out. I asked her once, near the end of my time there, why she'd stayed. My back had gone for good by then, and I was leaving for my sister's in Kansas, and it was the sort of thing a man asks when he's leaving and won't have to live with the answer. I asked her why, knowing all she knew, she'd stayed. She was quiet a while. Her hand went up, not to check for the jade, it was there, but to hold it, the way she used to, pressed to her breastbone, reporting the day to her mother. "Where I come from," she said, "we do not think a person is only the worst thing they did." She looked at the fire. "He watched me fall, yes, I do not forget it, I will not forget it." A long pause. "But he ride 3 weeks to buy back my mother, and he did not have a door, and he made one so late so bad, but he made one. A person is the wall." She turned the jade in her fingers. And a person is also the door they cut in it, even too late. I stay for the door. Then she said one more thing, the last thing she ever said to me, and I've carried it the whole way to this dead watch and this cold night and this telling. She said, "You keep count, Ezra, the little book, the winding." She'd seen it all, of course. She saw everything. "You keep count of what people owe him too, me too." She set the jade down against her breast and folded her hands. "One day you must stop counting, or you will die with a full book and an empty." She didn't finish it. I've thought 1,000 times about how she didn't finish it, whether she couldn't find the English word or whether she left it open on purpose. The way Silas left the cellar open, a door she couldn't quite push the last word through. Or whether she just decided, in her wisdom, that a widower winding a dead watch would fill in the end of that sentence better than she ever could. I filled it in. I've been filling it in for 11 years. I never did get the watch to run. But I stopped winding it, somewhere on the road to Kansas, and I put it in the box with Sarah's photograph, and I closed the book of debts, or most of it. Or I've been trying to, which she'd probably tell me is the same thing if you keep at it long enough. Silas Vance died rich and quiet in the house with the glass windows, and they buried him in the yard under the sky, next to a second stone that had no body under it and one word carved on it, Amos. May had it cut. She outlived him by some years in the house he finally built her, and when she died they found the ledger in the cellar closed and put away, and beside it, in her own hand this time, in careful English, a single line added under his. I don't know what it said, that's the truth. I was in Kansas. Somebody told me there was a line and that it was short, and that whoever read it out to the folks at the burying couldn't get through it steady. And I've decided, sitting here, that I don't want to know what it said after all. Some accounts you leave closed, some last things you let the other one keep. I only hope, winding nothing, counting nothing, an old man at the far edge of it, I only hope she wrote that she stayed for the door.